thank the organizers for inviting me. So let's go straight into the heart of the topic about this horse controversy, which has been, to my mind, very badly treated from all sides. There is a lot of misconception. There's very poor methodology, mixing of concepts, and oversimplifications. Now, look at very quickly these quotations, which I'm not going to read out. They are the standard view of those who propounded the Aryan invasion or Aryan migration theory, where, according to them, sometimes the horse-drawn cart plays a very important part. So the horse is the Aryan beast, and the Rig-Veda, composed by the Aryans, supposedly according to this school of thought, after the Aryans enter India, is a horse-centered text, and so on and so forth. So we have a lot of these scholars, all very fine scholars in their own ways, promoting this sort of concept about the terror-striking beast of the steppes, therefore facilitating the conquest of Northwest India initially by the incoming Aryans. This is the theory. And also Urmila Thapar here, the horse and the chariot with a spoked wheel, both of which were new to the subcontinent. You will see this. And finally, Michel, who actually gives us a very nice illustration of how colonial thinking can affect all these concepts, because you see how the first appearance of thundering chariots must have stricken the local population with a terror similar to that experienced by the Aztecs and Incas upon the arrival of the ironclad horse-riding Spaniards. So we have a parallel between the colonial conquest of the Middle Ages and that of protohistoric India. Very well. This is so well established that you find it in every single textbook, reference book, encyclopedia, and dictionary, and whatnot. And yet it hides very subtle arguments which are completely missed in the process. So this is, of course, the summary of their doctrine. But we will see that, and they also maintain that no horse remains were found in the cities, and the horse is never depicted in Harappan art. 2 points which I'm going to challenge to some extent. And therefore, Harappan culture cannot be Vedic by definition. So there's a lot of circularity here, because what we have seen in the previous slides are actually assumptions. And the fact that there are no horse remains and no depictions is another assumption. But out of these two assumptions, you create a dead certainty, which is the last sentence. And if you need actual evidence, well, this is it from a textbook used a few years ago in Tamil Nadu, where you see the actual Aryans invading the Harappan cities and destroying them. Of course, a fact that archaeology has completely rejected, but still, you know, our textbooks are always lagging behind. Let it be. So first of all, let's look at some of the questions of the horse remains. And I'm going, first of all, to take two proponents of the Aryan invasion in its hardcore forms. One is Mortimer Wheeler, very well known, and he was aware that horse remains had been found and identified. I have to skip all the details, but they are in some papers of mine. You can find all the references. And in fact, Rana Gundai in northern Baluchistan, they are found in the bottommost earliest layer, which is probably early Harappan, or at least mature, but not late. And he accepts that horse and ass are recorded. And there are other evidences which he himself quotes. And his conclusion is that camel, horse, and ass were, in fact, all a familiar feature of the Indus caravans of traders, you know, all these interactions that we've been hearing about in the last couple of days. So it's interesting to see a hardcore invasionist admitting this. And another is Stuart Pigott, author of a famous book on Indian prehistory in 1950, which was a standard book for a long, long time, where he accepts that apparently domesticated horse appears again at Ranagundai, though rarely in the Harappan culture. One cannot therefore hold, very interesting, that the Aryans were the first people to domesticate the horse in India or in its western borderlands, but they were certainly the first to introduce the idea of rapid transport made possible by its use. And you will see how he contradicts himself in a few slides. Very interesting. So anyhow, I'll not go over the evidence. It's too well known. It has been debated. Professor Bibilal has it in his books. I have mentioned it also in my papers and many other scholars. There are 12 Harappan sites which have yielded remains of horse bones and teeth, and some of them, the archaeologists who have examined them sometimes distinguish horse bones from wild ass or domesticated ass. All this is listed in the literature. In fact, when this was sometimes challenged, especially in the case of Surkotada, here you see some bone remains, there are also tooth remains, then certain controversies happen and debates, but debates were usually uncommon. This one debate was triggered by a report by the late Hungarian archaeologist Bököny, who happens to be an authority on the spread of the horse in Asia and Europe, protohistorical Europe, and who gave ASI a brief report that the Surkotada horse remains, which had been identified as such by A.K. Sharma, were indeed of the domesticated horse. Now this triggered, because Bököny was an authority, A.K. Sharma could have been ignored, but not Bököny. And therefore he was challenged by Richard Meadow, who wrote a long article to prove that this was still wild ass and not horse. Bököny made a long, detailed reply and stuck to his stand, and this is a very civilized, courteous, but very scholarly technical debate between the two. But in the end, he stuck to his stand, and he said, no, this is, and there are marks on teeth, which also show domestication, and so on and so forth. So all this is published. Richard Meadow made a second rejoinder, and by the time A.K. Bököny could reply, he passed away. So this was the end of the debate, which is often what happens. But anyhow, we have an authority who was accepted as an authority for the horse propagation in protohistorical Europe, but not in India. And this is a pattern we are going to see again. So we have a lot of distinguished Indian archaeologists, like the late Professor P.K. Thomas, whom I was lucky to meet several times, and our Pramod Joglekar sitting here, who summarize all the evidence, and I will not go over it, but we heard, I think yesterday or the day before, we heard Pramod Joglekar here giving us an ambiguity index of horse bones across a number of sites, and it is actually higher than the wild ass, and it is quite a substantial index. Now the point is that we should mention at the same time that when you move to the late Harappan, post-Harappan period, so into the 2nd millennium BC to be simple, very few sites, actually not more than the mature Harappan sites, report horse bones at all. There's no marked increase in frequency, which you would expect if Aryans had entered India and brought the animal with them. Lastly, we have in Hastinapura, which is an early historical site, we have Bolanath, a very distinguished archaeologist working with ASI in the 1950s and beyond, reporting horse bones from a painted greyware site and identifying it as Equus caballus, or the true horse. Now, what's very interesting is that when Bolanath does this, in the 2nd millennium BC, it's accepted by everybody because the Aryans have brought the horse by then. When Bolanath reported horse remains, in the Harappan period, it was brushed aside as being confused with the wild ass. So we have a pattern here where archaeologists are incompetent in the Harappan period but become suddenly competent in the 2nd millennium BC. That's very interesting. So let me continue anyhow. It was at Lothal where he reported horse bones. So at Lothal this was dismissed, but in Hastinapura it's accepted. The same expert and the same kind of remains. Right. So now let's move to depiction. Harappan horse, the horse is not depicted, we are told, on Harappan seals. That is true. There is no clear depiction of the horse that we can identify. But then you see, it doesn't mean much in itself, because as is well known, and I'm not the first to mention this, the lion, the cow, the camel, the wolf, the cat, the jackal are also not depicted. And all of them, our archaeologists will tell us, did exist. In fact, there was a lot of bulls, there were lots of bulls on the seals. They would not have existed probably without cows also. So anyhow, these are cultural choices. Why are certain symbols selected and not others are purely dependent on certain cultural choices. We don't have to worry about that. Now, Dr. S.R. Rao at Lothal excavated this figurine and said this is a figure of a horse. It's not very impressive, we have to admit. And some others said, well, no, it can just be a dog, perhaps. Not impossible. The best argument here is the bushy tail, which is not found in horses. But we have to remain skeptical about this. It's not impressive. This is a little bit more impressive. And because of the elongated neck, and again the bushy tail broken. And this was identified by Ernst Mackay, who was also accepting the regular standard invasion Aryan theory, but he said this is a depiction of a horse. So here we have this from an invasionist himself. But the most striking evidence from my point of view is this object of 5 centimeters in height, very delicate, flimsy copper, probably it no longer exists today, I don't know, found at Harappa by M.S. Vaz, Archaeological Survey of India, in the proper urban phase. And he simply describes it as a 2-wheeled copper chariot. And the matter ends there. Until 10 years later, Stuart Pigott looks at it again and finds that there is a copper object, animal, depicted here in Mohenjo-daro. The chariot is in Harappa, which is of the same size, also copper, same kind of bulk. This object had been interpreted as a bull by Ernst Mackay, but Pigott disagrees. He says, no, the description is not compatible with the bull. The neck is elongated. The whole body is too flimsy. That's not how Harappans usually depict bulls. And what's very interesting is that there is an elongated straight tail which is completely unnatural and is broken at the end. That tail would exactly fit into the sockets which you see here. These 2 sockets, in fact 3. So he says that this very likely was a horse-drawn, this is Pigott, I'm not making it up, it's not my opinion, I'm just quoting him. Probably a horse-drawn chariot where there would have been 2 horses together, and we have the same design of loops at the bottom, you can see. So the objects are very much of the same style, and for him this was not a draught ox at all, but may rather be an attempt at the portrayal of an equid, presumably a horse. And this is Pigott, who himself said that it was the Aryans who had brought the horse-drawn cart into India. Very amusing. But anyway, let's move on. So what is the bottom line? If you look at the history of art depictions of the horse, and there are books that do that, I'm going to quote 2 names. The fact is that horse is very rarely represented in India at all until the Mauryan age. It's just a fact. This is T.K. Bishwas, who has authored a whole book on the question. And so he says that until the Mauryan, we don't have much. This is a depiction of the bottom part of the well-known Ashokan emblem, which is the emblem of the government of India. So you have the lions standing above this. But you have, the horse, the elephant, the bull, and what is the 4th? I'm sorry, I have a blank. Anyway, you have 4 animals. Lion I mentioned. Maybe a bull is the horse, maybe the lion is repeated, or I forget. But never mind. The horse is depicted beautifully. And there are very few earlier depictions. So we have another historian of art here. which gives an analysis of all the animals depicted of punch mark coins. You know that punch mark coins, historical India's first currency, appeared around 600, maybe 500 BC, and there are lots of symbols and lots of animals depicted on them. So you have all of these. I don't have to read them out, but not the horse. So the horse anyway is a rarity both in actual remains and in depictions until the classical period. Now I have to move on to the Vedic texts. So this was the archaeological, let us say, and historical evidence, extremely compressed and summarized. I've given more references in my papers on the question. And this is the point that we have to challenge the very, very first assumption that in the Rig-Veda, the horse is associated with the Aryans. It's not true. Just read the text. The Aryans in the Rig-Veda, first of all, there are no Aryans. Arya is not a jana in the Rig-Veda. We have about 30 janas in the Rig-Veda, including the Panchajanya. And they are listed. They are the Purus, the Kurus, the Druyus, the Panchalas, there are so many of them, the Anus and so on. There is no such thing as an Arya Jana in the Rig-Veda. It does not exist. Arya is not an ethnic term in the Rig-Veda. So when we say the Aryans, we are already distorting the text, number one. But let us say there are those who are Arya defenders of a certain culture and Arya conquerors of the Dasyus and the Panis and several other entities which are semi-demonic. There have been attempts to identify with actual indigenous population. That was the 19th century theory. Whether that is a correct interpretation or not, I will not go into today. The point is that those Dasyus and Panis, which are supposed to be, according to the mainstream theory, the enemies of the Aryans, also have horses. And I'm going to prove it very easily by just a few quotations. This is Indra smashing. He's always in the Rigveda. This is a fundamental theme, motif of the Rigveda. Indra smashing the fortresses or the purs of the Dasyus and the Panis and other, sometimes Dasas and so on. And what does he find? He finds, among other treasures, he finds 10 horses, 10 chariots with side horses. And there are many such passages. There is one, again, an Arya hero. I say Arya because that is what the Rigveda uses as an adjective, not as an ethnic term. So they are not Aryans, they are Arya people. Finds himself surrounded by Dasyus. Indra comes in his rescue, smashes them, and brought him back together with cows, horses, and chariots recovered from the Dasyus, right? And so on. Gain possession of the sun and horses and the cow that feeds many after smiting the Dasyus. These are different, and I'm giving you all the chapter and verse. You can yourself go to the Rigveda and check if you are skeptical. And finally, the famous dialogue between Sarama, the female dog sent out by Indra to conquer the treasures of the Panis. So she reaches, after an adventurous journey, a desolate region where they reside, and they are surprised and they try to get her to their side. So they first of all try to corrupt her. And they say, "Oh Sarama, see the treasure deep in the mountain, full of cows and horses of treasure." I'm giving you the Sanskrit here. "The Panis, that is we, guard it watchfully. You have come in vain to a rich dwelling." But then they will offer to share, and then there will be a whole dialogue where she refuses. She's adamant that Indra is going to come, smash your place, and conquer all this treasure and horses and cows. Why? She gives actually the reason. Why? Because you are not using these treasures according to Ritam. Ritam is the Vedic word for what will become dharma later. You are not using these treasures, this wealth, for the cosmic order. Therefore, Indra has a right to steal all this. And it's very interesting because we are told in the 19th century literature that the Dasyus and Panis are robbers, that they rob the cows from the Aryans. There's absolutely no such thing in the Rigveda. It's exactly the opposite. It is actually Indra and his followers who actually sees the cows and horses from the Panis and Dasyus. So what exactly are we talking about when we say that the horse is an Aryan animal? It's just that people do not wish to go back to the text. And in fact, Go and Ashwa, and this moves me to the next topic, are associated in a single phrase, which you can see, for example, above, Gobir, Ashvabir, and so on. 5 minutes, that should do, at least 30 times if we include the synonym. So anyway, Ashwa equals Aryan or horse equals Vedic is not a valid equation. Secondly, there are lots of metaphors. It is accepted by all scholars, all mainstream scholars, that Rigveda is a book of songs, of poems. It uses a lot of allegories, symbols, metaphors. It's not a textbook of geography. It's not a textbook of sociology. So I'm not going to, interest of time, I'm not going to read these out. You can just see how Ashwa becomes a symbol for something. And for example, the dawn is Gomati Ashwavati. Ushas is full of, and if you read the standard quotations, it becomes full of cows and horses. Now, several scholars, including Sri Aurobindo, he was writing before the discovery of the Harappan civilization, therefore he was not concerned with our problem, said that just as Go is accepted as being another metaphor for the light, because, Go, the cow gives milk, milk is white, and that is the light. That is standard, it's accepted. You can see Moni Williams' Dictionary of Sanskrit, it's there. But Ashwa, the metaphor, is not accepted. And yet he says it's very obvious that Ashwa stands for energy, dynamic power. And therefore, the translation would become, O dawn, full of light and energy. Now, which of the two you prefer, you kindly decide. I'm not imposing any, but it seems to me that the choice is very obvious. And same thing with Mata Gavam. Is it mother of light or is it mother of the cows? And establishing in us a mass of, I'm using a standard translation, the dawn is establishing in us a mass of cows and horses. Or should it be a mass of light and energy? You please decide. So, therefore, the horse is not always and actually not often the actual animal. Of course, the animal exists and becomes a pretext for a metaphor. But to simply say that because Ashwa occurs so many times, Vedic society was full of horses is a gross oversimplification. This is what Karen Thompson here explains. I will skip this in the interest of time, but she says that the horse is used to describe fire, sun, lightning, and the dawn herself. So therefore, we should stop thinking of the Rig-Veda as a garbled history book, as the British anthropologist, and I will close with him in a minute, finally says, and we have to look at it afresh. The same thing goes with the chariot. I'll not spend too much time, but see the metaphors also for the chariot. The horse moves faster than thought. The chariot moves faster than thought. And in all these passages, according to Karen Thompson again, but she's not the only scholar, the rathas are imaginary heavenly vehicles drawn by imaginary heavenly ashwas. So these translations of ashwa as ratha, as war chariot, which Papula does somewhere, are completely illegitimate. And what I found when I went through all the hymns systematically where ratha, the chariot, occurred, there is not a single hymn in the Rig-Veda where you find together the chariot, the horse, and the spoked wheel. And yet we are told, this is what Rumila Thapa told us at the start, that this is what the Aryans brought into India. So we have a fundamental contradiction when we look closely at the literature. So my conclusion is that probably there were some horses, not numerous samples, but there were some in the Harappan civilization, which even we have seen conventional scholars like Mortimer Wheeler, like Pigot. I could add Bridget Alchin, Bridget and Raymond Alchin. Also, they accepted that the horse might have existed in the Harappan civilization. It was known to the early Vedic society, but the Rig-Veda is totally silent on the numbers of horses to extrapolate a horse-rich society from the Rig-Veda is an illegitimate method. And finally, I'm back to Edmund Leach, one of the most distinguished anthropologists of the 20th century, British anthropologist, who says that the prominent place given to horses and chariots in the Rig-Veda, if anything, suggests that in the real society, as opposed to its mythological counterpart, horses and chariots were a rarity, ownership of which was a mark of aristocracy and kingly distinction. So if we look at such perspectives, we have to rethink the whole problem afresh. In that case, the Harappan civilization cannot be declared to be pre-Vedic on grounds of the horse argument alone. Thank you.